Even back in January, there were any number of reasons Roy Hepburn should not have signed up for that cruise. It wasn't evident then that a world economic crisis was coming and that the people of Ecuador would be starving when the ship was supposed to sail. But there was the matter of Mary's job. She did not yet know that she was about to be laid off, to be forced into early retirement, so she could not see how she, in good conscience, could take off 3 weeks in late November and early December right in the middle of a semester. Also, although she had never been there, she had grown very bored with the Galapagos archipelago. There was such a wealth of films and slides and books and articles about the islands, which she had used over and over in her courses, that she could not imagine any surprise that might await her there. Little did she know. She and Roy hadn't been out of the United States during their entire marriage. If they were going to kick up their heels and take a really glamorous trip, she thought, she would much rather go to Africa, where the wildlife was so much more thrilling and the survival schemes were so much more dangerous. When all was said and done, the creatures of the Galapagos Islands were a pretty listless bunch when compared with rhinos and hippos and lions and elephants and giraffes and so on. The prospect of the voyage, in fact, made her confess to a close friend, "All of a sudden I have this feeling that I never want to see another blue-footed booby as long as I live." Little did she know. Mary muted her misgivings about the trip, though, when talking to Roy, confident that he would perceive on his own that he had suffered a mild brain malfunction. But by March, Roy was out of his job, and Mary knew she was going to be let go in June. The timing of the cruise, anyway, became practical, and the cruise loomed huge in Roy's increasingly erratic imagination as, quote, "the only good thing we've got to look forward to," end of quote. Here was what had happened to their jobs. GEFF Co. had furloughed almost its entire workforce, blue-collar and white-collar alike, in order to modernize the Ilium operation. A Japanese company, Matsumoto, was doing the job. Matsumoto was also automating the Bahia de Darwin. This was the same company which employed Zenji Hiraguchi, the young computer genius, who would be staying with his wife at the Hotel El Dorado the same time that Mary was there. When the Matsumoto Corporation got through installing computers and robots, only 12 human beings would be able to run everything. So people young enough to have children, or at least ambitious dreams for the future, left town in droves. It was, as Mary Hepburn would say on her 81st birthday, 2 weeks before a great white shark ate her. That wasn't a quote. It was, as Mary Hepburn would say on her 81st birthday, 2 weeks before a great white shark ate her, quote, "as though the Pied Piper had passed through town," end of quote. Suddenly there were almost no children to educate, and the city was bankrupt for want of taxpayers, so Ilium High School would graduate its class in June. In April, Roy was diagnosed as having an inoperable brain tumor. The nature cruise of the century thereupon became what he was staying alive for. "I can hang on that long at least, Mary." "November, that's not far away, is it?" "No," she said. "I can hang on that long." "You could have years, Roy," she said. "Just let me take that cruise," he said. "Let me see penguins on the equator," he said. "That'll be good enough for me." While Roy was mistaken about more and more things, he was right about there being penguins on the Galapagos Islands. They were skinny things underneath their head waiters' costumes. They had to be. If they had been swaddled in fat like their relatives on the ice floes to the south, half a world away, they would have roasted to death when they came ashore on the lava to lay their eggs and tend their young. Like those of the flightless cormorants, their ancestors, too, had abandoned the glamour of aviation, electing to catch more fish instead. About that mystifying enthusiasm a million years ago for turning over as many human activities as possible to machinery. What could that have been but yet another acknowledgement by people that their brains were no damn good? God, so fucking brilliant. While Roy Hepburn was dying, and while the whole city of Ilium was dying for that matter, and while both the man and the city were being killed by growths inimical to a healthy and happy humanity, Roy's big brain persuaded him that he had been a sailor at the United States atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll, equatorial like Guayaquil in 1946. He was going to sue his own government for millions, he said, because the radiation he had absorbed there had first prevented his and Mary's having children, and now it had caused his brain cancer. Roy had served a hitch in the Navy, but otherwise his case against the United States of America was a weak one, since he was born in 1932, and his country's lawyers would have no trouble proving that. That would make him 14 years old at the time of his supposed exposure. That anachronism did not prevent his having vivid memories of the terrible things his government had made him do to so-called lower animals. As he told it, he worked virtually unassisted, first driving stakes into the ground all over the atoll, and then tying different sorts of animals to the stakes. Quote, "I guess they chose me," end of quote, he said, quote, "because animals have always trusted me," end of quote. This much was true. Animals all trusted Roy. While he had no formal education past high school, except for the apprentice program at GEFFCO, and while Mary had a master's degree in zoology from Indiana University, Roy was much better at actually relating to animals than Mary was. He could talk to birds in their own languages, for example, something she could never have done since her ancestors were notoriously tone deaf on both sides of her family. There was no dog or farm animal, not even a guard dog at GEFFCO, or a sow with piglets, so vicious that Roy couldn't, within 5 minutes or less, turn it into a friend of his. So Roy's tears were understandable when he remembered tying animals to all those stakes. Such a cruel experiment had been performed on animals, of course, on sheep and pigs and cattle and horses and monkeys and ducks and chickens and geese, but surely not on a zoo such as Roy described. To hear him tell it, he had tethered peacocks and snow leopards and gorillas and crocodiles and albatrosses to the stakes. In his big brain, Bikini became the exact reverse of Noah's Ark. 2 of every sort of animal had been brought there in order to be atom-bombed. The craziest detail in his story, which did not seem at all crazy to him, of course, was this one. Quote, "Donald was there," end of quote. Donald was a golden retriever male who was roaming the neighborhood there in Ilium at that very moment, probably, maybe right outside the Hepburns' house, and was only 4 years old. It was all very hard, Roy would say, but the hardest part was tying Donald to one of those stakes. I kept putting it off until I couldn't put it off any longer. Tying Donald to a stake was the last thing I had to do. He let me do it, and after I did it, he licked my hand and wagged that tail of his. And I said to him, and I'm not ashamed to say I cried, "So long, old pal. You're going to a different world now. It's sure to be a better one, since no other world could be as bad as this one is." While Roy began putting on such performances, Mary was still teaching every weekday, still assuring the few students she had left that they should thank God for their great big brains. Would you rather have the neck of a giraffe, or the camouflage of a chameleon, or the hide of a rhinoceros, or the antlers of an Irish elk, she would ask, and so on. She was still spouting the same old malarkey. Yes, and then she would go home to Roy and his demonstrations of how misleading a brain could be. He was never hospitalized, except briefly for tests, and he was docile. He wasn't to drive a car anymore, but he understood that and did not seem to resent it when Mary hid the keys to his Jeep station wagon. He even said that maybe they should sell it, since it didn't look like they were going to do much camping anymore. So Mary didn't have to hire a nurse to watch over Roy while she worked. Retired people in the neighborhood were glad to pick up a few dollars, keeping him company and making sure he didn't hurt himself in some way. He was certainly no trouble to them. He watched a lot of television and enjoyed playing for hours, never leaving the yard with Donald, the golden retriever who had died, supposedly, on Bikini Atoll. Let me deliver that one differently. He was certainly no trouble to them. He watched a lot of television and enjoyed playing for hours, never leaving the yard with Donald, the golden retriever who had died, supposedly, on Bikini Atoll. As Mary delivered what was to be her last lecture about the Galapagos Islands, though, she would be stopped in mid-sentence for 5 seconds by a doubt which, if expressed in words, might have come out something like this, quote, Maybe I'm just a crazy lady who has wandered off the street and into this classroom and started explaining the mysteries of life to these young people. And they believe me, although I am utterly mistaken about simply everything, end of quote. She had to wonder, too, about all the supposedly great teachers of the past who, although their brains were healthy, had turned out to be as wrong as Roy about what was really going on. How many Galapagos Islands were there a million years ago? There were 13 big ones, 17 small ones, and 318 tiny ones, some nothing more than rocks rising only a meter or two above the surface of the ocean. There are now 14 big ones, 7 small ones, and 326 tiny ones. Quite a lot of volcanic activity still goes on. I make a joke. The gods are still angry. And the northernmost of the islands, so all alone, so far from the rest, is still Santa Rosalia. Yes, and a million years ago, on August 3rd, 1986, a man named Roy Hepburn was on his deathbed in his tight little home in Ilium, New York. There at the very end, what he lamented most was that he and his wife Mary had never had children. He could not urge his wife to try to have children by someone else after he was gone, since she had ceased to ovulate. We Hepburns are extinct as the dodos now, he said, and he rambled on with the names of many other creatures which had become fruitless, leafless twigs on the tree of evolution. The Irish elk, he said. The ivory-billed woodpecker, he said. Tyrannosaurus rex, he said, and on, right up to the end. Though his dry sense of humor would pop up unexpectedly, he made 2 jocular additions to the lugubrious roll call, both of which were indeed without progeny. Smallpox, he said, and then George Washington. Right to the end, he believed with all his heart that his own government had done him in with radiation. He said to Mary and to the doctor and the nurse who were there, because the end could surely come at any moment now, quote, "If only it had been just God Almighty who was mad at me," end of quote. Mary took that to be his curtain line. He certainly looked dead after that. But then after 10 seconds, his blue lips moved again. Mary leaned close to hear his words. She would be glad for the rest of her life that she had not missed them. "I'll tell you what the human soul is, Mary," he whispered, his eyes closed. "Animals don't have one. It's the part of you that knows when your brain isn't working right. I always knew, Mary. There wasn't anything I could do about it, but I always knew." And then he scared the wits out of Mary and everybody in the room by sitting up straight, his eyes open wide and fiery. "Get the Bible," he commanded, in a voice which could be heard throughout the house. This was the only time anything to do with formal religion was mentioned during the whole of his illness. He and Mary were no churchgoers or prayers in even dire circumstances, but they did have a Bible somewhere, and Mary wasn't quite sure where. "Get the Bible," he said again. "Woman, get the Bible." He had never called her woman before. So Mary went to look for it. She found it in the spare bedroom, along with Darwin's The Voyage of the Beagle and A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Roy sat up and he called Mary woman again. "Woman," he commanded. "Put your hand on the Bible and repeat after me. I, Mary Hepburn, hereby make 2 solemn promises to my beloved husband on his deathbed." So she said that. She expected, and in fact hoped, that the 2 promises would be so bizarre, perhaps having to do with suing the government, that there would be no possibility of her keeping either one. But she was not to be so lucky. The first promise was that she'd do her best to get married again as soon as possible and not waste time in moping and feeling sorry for herself. The second was that she'd go to Guayaquil in November and take the nature cruise of the century for both of them. "My spirit will be there with you every inch of the way," he said. And he died.